In August of 2017, a man named Garrett Harwood sat at a kitchen table that had fed 4 generations of his family. The table was pine-scarred by decades of use stained by coffee and lamp oil, and the ink of ballpoint pens that had recorded the small and large transactions of a working life. On it sat a single check. The amount was $187,450. Garrett was 29 years old. He had a marketing degree from NC State. He had spent 3 years writing copy for a mid-sized firm in Raleigh, crafting words designed to make people want things they didn't need. He understood numbers. He understood value. But he sat there for a long time looking at that check, trying to fully absorb what it represented. It was not an inheritance. It was not a settlement. It was not a lucky position in a rising market or a windfall from a decision made years ago and forgotten. It was the annual profit after every cost was accounted for of a farm business built almost entirely on something a local brewery had considered garbage. To understand how that check came to exist, you have to go back 14 years. You have to go back to a Tuesday morning in May of 2003. And you have to start with a man who most people in Caldwell County, North Carolina, knew well but very few truly understood. His name was Elias Harwood. He was 62 years old. He had been born on the same land where he would one day die. 88 acres of rolling foothills, where the soil ran red and clay heavy and stubborn, a land that rewarded patience and punished impatience in equal and unforgiving measure. His great-grandfather had purchased that land in 1889 for $1,100, a sum that represented everything a man with strong hands and clear vision could scrape together in a single lifetime. Every generation of Harwood men since had worked it, improved it, and handed it forward. Elias had inherited not just the land, but a way of seeing it. He was a tall man, lean in the way that only decades of outdoor labor produces, the kind of lean that has nothing to do with diet or exercise routines and everything to do with the simple burning of calories through useful work. His hands were large and permanently darkened at the knuckles. His face was the face of a man who had spent 62 years reading weather reading, soil reading, the small and patient language that the natural world speaks to those willing to slow down enough to listen. People in the county knew 3 things about Elias Harwood. He never threw away a piece of baling twine. Every length of it, no matter how short or frayed, went into a coffee can in the barn, and eventually every piece of it got used for something. This was not poverty. This was principle. There was a difference, and Elias understood that difference in his bones. His fences were always perfectly straight. Not nearly straight. Not straight enough. Perfectly. A fence post set crooked was to Elias a kind of moral failing evidence of a man who had decided that close enough was good enough, and that kind of thinking, Elias believed, had a way of spreading from fence posts into everything else a man did. And he believed, with the quiet certainty of a man who has tested a theory across decades, that the solution to most problems was already present on your land, waiting if you were patient enough and observant enough to see it. He ran a small cattle operation. 12 head, nothing more, grazed on pasture he managed with a care that bordered on reverence. He cut his own hay from the lower fields. He repaired his own equipment with parts salvaged from machines that had died of other causes. He had a small vegetable garden that fed him through summer and fall, and a root cellar beneath the house that stretched that harvest through winter. He was not a wealthy man by any conventional measure, but he owed nothing to anyone, and on the 88 acres his great-grandfather had purchased, he was absolutely sovereign. Now you need to understand the brewery. Cedar Ridge Brewing had started in 1998, the passion project of 2 old friends who had met in college and bonded over a shared love of German-style lagers. They had rented a warehouse on the eastern edge of town and started small, the way all good things start, with more belief than capital and more enthusiasm than experience. By 2003, they had proven something real. The beer was good, genuinely, carefully good. The local market had noticed, then embraced it, and the 2 friends found themselves running something larger and more demanding than either had originally imagined. That spring, Cedar Ridge upgraded from a 7-barrel brewing system to a 30-barrel system. It was the right move. It was also the moment a manageable inconvenience became a serious logistical problem. Spent grain. After the mashing process, where malted barley is steeped and the fermentable sugars drawn out to feed the yeast, what remains is tons of wet, steaming, protein-rich grain. It smells almost pleasant at first, something close to warm bread or a sweetened porridge. But it begins to sour within 24 hours, and once it turns hard and fast and foul. For a small brewery on a 7-barrel system, spent grain was an annoyance managed twice a week. For a 30-barrel operation, it was a crisis that arrived on a schedule and refused to be postponed. The local landfill charged $50 a ton in tipping fees. Cedar Ridge was generating nearly 15 tons of spent grain every week. That was $750 a week, $39,000 a year, for the privilege of getting rid of something that the brewing process made unavoidable. Owen Calloway, one of the brewery's co-founders, was a practical man who had grown up in Caldwell County and retained the resourceful, waste-nothing thinking of a rural upbringing even after years of running a business. He knew Elias Harwood the way everyone in the county knew Elias Harwood, by reputation, by the natural social gravity of small communities where families occupy the same ground across generations. Owen's father had purchased a Hereford bull from Elias's father years before. That kind of transaction in that kind of community created a thread of connection that didn't disappear with time. On a Tuesday morning in May of 2003, Owen Calloway drove his dusty Ford Ranger 4 miles out of town on a county road that wound between fence lines and stands of mixed pine and oak. He turned down the gravel lane to the Harwood farm and found Elias at the gate to the near pasture, mending a broken latch with a piece of wire he had almost certainly been carrying in his shirt pocket for reasons he hadn't yet identified until that moment presented itself. Owen explained the problem plainly. He was a practical man, and he respected practical men, and so he did not dress the thing up or try to make it sound like something other than what it was. He had too much grain, and it was costing him real money to get rid of it. Elias raised cattle. Did he have any use for spent brewery grain as a feed supplement? And then Owen laid out the arrangement. Simple and clean. The brewery's flatbed truck would come out to the Harwood farm every Monday and Thursday morning and back up to the section of ground along the far western fence line. Dump the grain, drive away. The brewery paid nothing for disposal. Elias paid nothing for the grain. 2 problems, 1 handshake. Owen pointed to the spot. A 1/4-acre patch near the western property line, accessible from the road, visible from the lane. Nothing much grew there but broom sedge and the occasional stubborn thistle. It was the kind of ground that looks as though it has quietly given up. Elias looked at it. He stood very still for what Owen would later describe with a slight unease he couldn't fully explain as a long time. Long enough that Owen began to wonder if he had somehow misspoken. Long enough that the only sounds were the wind working through the pines along the fence line and the distant, confident commentary of a mockingbird staking out territory in the oaks. What Owen Calloway did not know and could not have known was that in those 30 seconds of silence, Elias Harwood was not thinking about his cattle at all. He was thinking about something else entirely. Something he had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for the right set of circumstances to make possible. "That'll work," Elias said. They shook hands. Owen drove back toward town, and the following Monday morning the first truck from Cedar Ridge Brewing backed carefully down the lane, swung wide at the gate to clear the post, and deposited a steaming, fragrant mass of spent grain onto that tired 1/4 acre of broom sedge and red clay. It would not be the last. For the next year and a half the trucks came. Every Monday, every Thursday. The pile grew and settled and spread, steaming in cold mornings and baking under the summer sun, until the surface crusted over while the interior stayed warm. The neighbors who drove past on the county road could smell it when the wind was right. A few of them stopped to ask Elias what he was planning. He told them he was working on something. They nodded and drove on the way. People do when an answer is technically complete but raises more questions than it settles. What Elias was doing in those first 14 months was watching. He watched the way the spent grain settled into layers. He watched how rain moved through it, how it drained where it pooled. He watched the deer come from the wood line at dusk to nose at the edges, noting which sections they returned to and which they avoided. He took samples with a short-handled spade, mixed them in different ratios with the red clay of that neglected ground, and observed what happened over weeks and months as the combination broke down and transformed into something darker and richer than what he had started with. He was learning the nature of the material, not from an agricultural extension pamphlet or a university bulletin. He was learning the way his great-grandfather had learned things, by direct and sustained observation, by the slow accumulation of first-hand evidence, by the discipline of watching before acting, that the modern world had largely decided it could no longer afford. His grandson thought he had taken leave of his senses. Garrett Harwood was 15 that summer, old enough to hold opinions and young enough to deliver them without much diplomatic packaging. He would come out to the western fence line, sometimes drawn by a mixture of genuine affection and the restless curiosity of adolescence, and he would stand at the edge of the pile with his shirt pulled up over his nose. "Grandpa," he said one afternoon, his voice muffled by the fabric, "this whole thing stinks. Why not just buy some bags of pellets from the co-op and be done with it?" He meant the smell, but he also meant the situation in the broader sense that teenagers often mean things. The inexplicable patience of an old man standing at the edge of a mountain of brewery waste as though waiting for it to say something useful. Elias looked at his grandson for a moment. There was no irritation in his expression, no defensiveness. "This is better," he said, "and it's free." Garrett shook his head and went back to the barn. Elias stood a moment longer at the fence line, looking at the pile, with an expression that Garrett at 15 did not yet have the tools or experience to read. It was not the expression of a man who had simply found a convenient source of cheap feed. It was something more considered, more settled, arrived at through a process of observation and thought that was not yet finished, but was moving toward a destination that Elias could see with growing clarity. In October of 2003, on a Thursday morning, when the air had turned and the oaks along the creek were burning with the colors of the season, Elias loaded a wooden slatted cage into the bed of his 1988 Chevrolet S10 and drove east. He drove through the Piedmont and down into the coastal plain, through small towns that seemed to be quietly negotiating with themselves about whether to continue existing past fields of tobacco and sweet potato and longleaf pine. He drove 350 miles to a small operation in Sampson County that he had located through a network of contacts built entirely outside the internet, operating on the older and more durable currency of reputation and personal endorsement. He came home with 4 pigs. They were not the pink, heavily muscled, commercially optimized hogs that filled the industrial confinement barns of that part of North Carolina. Those animals were the product of decades of selective breeding aimed at a single objective: maximum usable pounds in minimum time on minimum feed input. They were efficient in the way that a well-designed machine is efficient. They represented in their context a genuine achievement of agricultural engineering. What Elias brought home was something different, something older and in its own way more complete. Gloucester Old Spots, a heritage breed with deep roots in the English countryside, sometimes called the orchard pig, for their centuries-long habit of foraging beneath apple trees for windfalls and fermenting fruit. They were large animals, white with irregular black spots of varying size, with heavy floppy ears that draped forward over their eyes and gave them an expression of permanent mild surprise. They moved with a quality that was the opposite of the twitchy, confined restlessness of commercial breeds. They were deliberate, unhurried, almost companionable in their manner. And by the standards of the modern pork industry, they were deeply, perhaps fatally unfashionable. They grew slowly. That was the problem, the single disqualifying characteristic that had pushed the breed to the margins of commercial production and into the hands of a scattered network of heritage breeders and stubborn traditionalists. In an industry that measured success in pounds gained per day and days required to reach market weight, slow growth was not a quirk to be tolerated. It was a liability. The industrial system had no room for an animal that insisted on taking its time. Elias paid $1,200 cash for 3 gilts and 1 young boar. When Garrett saw them come off the truck that afternoon, standing with his hands in his jacket pockets in the thin autumn light, he looked at the animals and then at his grandfather, with the particular expression of someone trying to balance genuine love against honest bewilderment. "Grandpa," he said carefully, "those are the slow ones. The man at the co-op said those old breeds barely hit 2 pounds a day, and they're going to carry fat. The market doesn't want fat pigs." Elias looked at the 4 animals settling into their temporary pen, assessing them with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything that mattered. "The market's wrong," he said. Garrett started to respond, then stopped. There was something in the way Elias said it, not with the stubborn irrationality of an old man defending a poor decision against obvious evidence, but with the settled certainty of someone who has done his thinking and arrived at solid ground that made further argument feel beside the point. Elias built the pigs a home in a 5-acre section of mixed hardwood on the northwest corner of the property, fenced with the care he brought to all his fencing. The posts set straight and plumb, the wire strung tight and true. There were hickories in that woodlot, and several large oaks, and a low corner that stayed damp enough in spring to grow the kind of lush ground cover that a rooting pig considers a personal gift from a generous universe. He constructed a three-sided shelter from reclaimed lumber, solid and weatherproof, with a south-facing opening that would catch winter sun. Every morning before anything else, he loaded the bed of his John Deere Gator, drove down to the western fence line, scooped spent grain from the edge of the pile, and drove it to the woodlot. He did not dump it in a trough. He scattered it, spread it widely across the ground so that the pigs were required to move and root and dig to find it, working the soil as they fed, turning it, aerating it, depositing fertility as they went. He understood something fundamental about the relationship between foraging behavior and the quality of what a foraging animal produces, a thing that had been known and practiced for centuries before the industrial system decided it was an inconvenient variable to be eliminated. The grain was the foundation, but it was never the whole of the system. When the acorns fell through autumn, the pigs found them with the purposeful enthusiasm of animals, doing exactly what their nature prepared them to do. When the wild apples dropped in September at the neglected orchard down the road, Elias collected them in bushel baskets and drove them to the woodlot. He made an arrangement with the owner of the local produce market to collect whatever couldn't be sold before it spoiled. Wilted lettuce, bruised tomatoes, soft squash and corn gone past its prime. The pigs ate with a variety and genuine richness that bore no resemblance to the uniform corn and soy diet of industrial pork production. The soil in the woodlot began to change. Slowly then, more noticeably. The constant rooting turned and broke and aerated the red clay. The organic matter, grain and fruit and vegetable and manure, was incorporated into the ground at a rate and depth that no mechanical amendment could easily replicate. The earthworm population, which any farmer will tell you is the truest indicator of soil health, began visibly increasing. The ground grew darker, richer, more alive in the way that soil can be alive when it is treated as an ecosystem rather than a substrate. The system was beginning to close in on itself, each element feeding the next. The brewery's waste becoming the pig's diet, becoming the soil's fertility, becoming the foundation of something that asked progressively less from the outside world. None of this was visible from the county road. None of it generated the kind of profit that anyone passing by would have called impressive. But Elias Harwood was not building for the view from the road, and he was not building for the short term. He had never built for the short term in his life. And in that 5-acre woodlot in the North Carolina foothills on ground that had once grown nothing but broom sedge and stubborn clay, something significant had quietly, without announcement or fanfare, begun. The first litter arrived in the spring of 2004. 11 piglets born in the three-sided shelter on a cold April morning when fog still lay in the low corners of the woodlot and the oaks had not yet pushed out their first tentative leaves. Elias was there before sunrise, had been checking through the night with the calm vigilance of a man who understood that presence during important moments was itself a form of care. He watched the births with the steady attention of someone who knows when to act and when to simply witness. All 11 survived. He raised them through the summer, through the heat and the long, humid days of a North Carolina Piedmont season. They grew with the unhurried steadiness that was the old spot's most consistent and commercially inconvenient quality. By late autumn, they had reached a weight that would satisfy the regional market, and Elias selected 9 for sale, keeping 2 back for the freezer. He loaded them on a Tuesday morning and drove to the regional livestock auction in the next county. The auctioneer was a man named Wendell Cross, who had known Elias for 30 years and had moved cattle for him on several occasions. Wendell was a professional, which meant he saw animals the way the market saw them, as pounds and grade and conformation against a predictable standard. He walked the pen and looked at the 9 hogs with practiced efficiency. He sucked air through his teeth. "They're carrying some cover, Elias," he said. He meant fat. He meant that by the metrics the commodity pork industry used to assign value, these animals were improperly finished, too richly layered, insufficiently lean for the processing lines that wanted a uniform and predictable product. Market's going to reflect that. They sold at 58 cents a pound live weight. Average. Unremarkable. The kind of return that, if it were the ceiling of your ambition, would represent a modest operation producing modest results for the foreseeable future. Elias collected the money, drove home, and sat on the back porch in the November cold with a cup of coffee, doing arithmetic in his head. He was not discouraged. Discouragement requires a gap between what you expected and what you received. Elias had expected exactly this. He had known what the auction would pay before he loaded the truck that morning. The auction price was not a verdict on his system. It was a data point confirming that the system he was building and the market he was building it for were not yet the same market. One of them would have to change. Elias was reasonably confident it would not be him. The rhythm established itself in the years that followed with the unhurried season-by-season cadence that genuine long-term enterprise requires. Twice a week every week, the truck from Cedar Ridge Brewing came down the lane. Twice a week, every morning, Elias loaded the gator. The pile at the western fence line was replenished and drawn down in a continuous cycle that became as natural a feature of the farm's landscape as the creek or the woodlot or the lower hayfield. The seasons turned, the herd grew slowly and deliberately because Elias was selective in a way that the auction barn mentality could not accommodate and would not reward. He kept only the gilts with the strongest maternal instincts, the ones that stayed calm when the environment changed, attentive to their litters, efficient in the way that a genuinely good mother is efficient. He was breeding not just for size or growth rate, but for a population of animals specifically suited to the life they would live. The foraging environment, the varied diet, the particular rhythms of that 5-acre woodlot on a North Carolina hillside. The herd grew. The prices at the auction fluctuated between 55 cents and 70 cents a pound across those early years. Elias made a small profit annually enough to cover his costs and set a modest amount aside, but not the kind of return that would have impressed anyone looking from outside. He put the profit back into the operation without ceremony. Garrett watched all of this from the comfortable distance of someone who has not yet been proven wrong about something he is very confident about. He went off to college to study business at NC State in the fall of 2006, carrying with him the settled conviction that there were more efficient paths to a livelihood than watching pigs root through brewery garbage on 88 acres of red clay hill country in the North Carolina foothills. He loved his grandfather without reservation. He simply did not understand what his grandfather was doing, or more precisely, he thought he understood, and was certain it was a charming but economically limited enterprise. While Garrett was learning about supply chains and market analysis and the quantitative tools of modern business management, the world outside his grandfather's fence line was changing in ways that would eventually turn back and find Elias Harwood with the accuracy of something that had been looking for him all along. Cedar Ridge Brewing was thriving. Their IPA won a silver medal at the Great American Beer Festival in 2009, a recognition that opened doors and changed the nature of conversations with distributors. They signed a deal that put their beer in 3 states. In 2011, they installed a new 60-barrel brew house and a canning line that allowed them to reach retail markets they had previously been unable to serve. The spent grain output, which had stood at 15 tons a week when Owen Callaway first drove out to the Harwood farm, climbed steadily toward 20 tons as production expanded. The trucks still came, every Monday, every Thursday. The arrangement still rested entirely on a handshake and mutual convenience, as it always had, as informal and durable as the relationship between the two families that had preceded it. In 2013, Cedar Ridge hired a new operations manager. His name was Nolan Briggs. He was 34 years old. He had earned an MBA from UNC Charlotte while working nights managing logistics for a regional textile company, which meant he had learned the discipline of optimization under real operational pressure and arrived at Cedar Ridge already confident in both the theory and the practice. He drove a Ford F-150 King Ranch Edition that he maintained in a condition that suggested it had never encountered unpaved roads. His Carhartt work jacket, worn on site visits to signal a practical sleeves-rolled-up sensibility, still held the memory of retail packaging in its creases. Nolan believed with the sincere conviction of a man who has not yet been expensively wrong about something he was very sure of, that every process could be analyzed, every resource quantified, and every informal arrangement professionalized into something documented and measurable and managed. One of the first things he did at Cedar Ridge was go through the operational accounts with the thoroughness of a man determined to fully understand what he had inherited. He found the spent grain line. Disposal cost $0. No contract, no liability documentation, no formal agreement of any kind. A notation in the operational log indicating that spent grain was collected by a local farmer under an informal arrangement dating to 2003. A decade of twice-weekly deliveries with no legal architecture, supporting them beyond a handshake between Owen Callaway and a farmer on a county road. Nolan flagged it the same afternoon. He drove out to the Harwood farm on a Wednesday in early spring, his tablet loaded with the relevant operational data, his boots clean, and his expression professional. He found Elias turning a compost windrow behind the barn with a long-handled fork, working with the steady, unhurried economy of someone who has performed a task so many times that the body handles it without demanding the mind's full attention. Nolan introduced himself with the direct eye contact and firm handshake of a man who has been taught that first impressions are foundational. He explained his role. He explained that he was conducting a systematic review of all operational processes. He showed Elias the relevant line on his tablet spreadsheet, indicating with a precise finger where the grain arrangement lived in the brewery's financial architecture. "We want to get something formal in place," he said. "Protect both parties. Standard risk management." Elias set the fork against the compost pile and wiped his hands on his work pants. He looked at the young man. He did not look at the tablet. "Been working fine for 10 years, he said. "I understand that, but from a liability standpoint, you do what you need to do," Elias said, and picked up the fork and went back to work. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. Nolan drove back to town and made a note in his operational file. The informal arrangement continued without formal modification. But something had shifted in the relationship between the brewery and the farm invisibly, and without announcement, the way the angle of a geological fault shifts in the dark before the surface ever knows anything has changed. Nolan Briggs had seen the arrangement. He had cataloged it. He had filed it under problems awaiting resolution. And men like Nolan Briggs and Elias's long experience of the world did not leave cataloged problems unresolved indefinitely. But that reckoning was still years away. What arrived first was the market. The farm-to-table movement had been building across American food culture for years, growing from the preference of a small and easily dismissed urban minority into something that was genuinely restructuring the way serious restaurants conceived of their identity and their relationship with their suppliers. Chefs in mid-sized cities were discovering that the story behind the food was not decorative. For the customers they were trying to build relationships with, the story was integral to the value of the meal itself. Provenance mattered. Rearing practice mattered. The difference between a heritage breed animal raised on varied inputs in a natural environment and a commodity hog finished on concrete with corn and soy was not merely a difference in flavor profile. It was a difference in philosophy, and there were customers who would pay significantly and consistently to align their consumption with a philosophy they respected. The pork that came out of Elias Harwood's woodlot was not like commodity pork in any way that a person who had eaten both could fail to notice. The fat was different in color, in texture, in the way it rendered slowly and completely in a cast iron pan, in the layered complex flavor it contributed to everything it touched. The muscle was darker and more densely grained. The flavor carried something that food writers were beginning to call terroir borrowing, the wine world's vocabulary for the idea that a product carries within it the specific character of the place and practice that produced it. Elias's hogs had eaten spent brewery grain and forest acorns and orchard windfalls and the surplus of a local produce market. They had rooted through 5 acres of North Carolina hardwood across 4 seasons a year for over a decade. They carried all of that in them, in their fat, in their muscle, in the particular and unreplicable flavor of the meat they produced. In the spring of 2014, a chef named Sutton Webb drove 90 minutes from Asheville to find out if a rumor was accurate. Sutton Webb was 31 years old and had recently opened his own restaurant after a decade of working in other people's kitchens in Charlotte and Atlanta, learning the craft and accumulating the particular kind of conviction that eventually makes a person willing to take on the risk of their own operation. He was building a menu around provenance, around the genuine commitment to knowing exactly where every ingredient came from and being able to tell that story to his customers with specificity and without embellishment. He had heard from another chef about an old man in the foothills raising spotted heritage hogs on brewery waste and selling them at the livestock auction for commodity prices because no one had yet shown him there was another option. He turned down the Harwood Farm Lane on a Wednesday morning in April. The dogwoods along the creek were just opening, and the air had the particular quality of early spring in the southern highlands, cool and clear, with the smell of wet soil and new growth moving through it. He found Elias in the woodlot, moving through the trees with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in the specific geography of his own land. Sutton Webb did not open with a price. He did not begin with a negotiation. He asked if he could walk the woodlot. They walked it together for the better part of 20 minutes, mostly in silence. The chef looked at the condition of the soil, at the way the animals moved through the trees, at the brightness of their eyes and the quality of their coats. He crouched at one point and pressed his palm flat against the ground, feeling the texture of the dark worked earth. "What do they eat?" he asked. Elias told him. "The spent grain from the brewery twice weekly scattered across the ground rather than deposited in a trough. The acorns through fall, the apples from the abandoned orchard down the road, the surplus produce from the market in town." He described the system plainly without embellishment, the way you describe something that is simply what it is and needs no improvement from language. Sutton Webb listened with the focused attention of someone receiving information that is confirming something he suspected but had not yet been able to verify. "I want 2 hogs," he said. "Hanging weight after processing." He named his price, $4.25 a pound. A 250-pound Gloucester Old Spot processed yielded approximately 180 pounds of hanging weight. At $4.25 a pound, that was $765 per animal. At the Caldwell County Livestock Auction on a good day, that same animal brought $175. Garrett Harwood was home that week. He had finished a project in Raleigh and had come back for a few days the way he did periodically, drawn by the pull of the place and the uncomplicated pleasure of his grandfather's company. He was standing near the barn when Sutton Webb wrote his check and handed it to Elias. He watched the exchange. He watched the manner the chef brought to it, the particular quality of respect the man extended to Elias and to the animals and to the operation. A respect that was not politeness or social performance, but genuine recognition, the recognition of someone who understood what quality cost to produce and was grateful to have located it. And then Garrett looked at the number on the check. He stood very still. Then he took his phone from his pocket and walked to the woodlot fence. One of the gilts was working the ground near the fence line, her broad snout moving methodically through the dark leaf litter. Her heavy ears draped forward over her eyes. Her coat was white with the irregular black markings that gave the breed its identity. Her snout was thoroughly muddy. Garrett took a photograph. It was not a composed image. It was just a spotted pig with a muddy nose on a Wednesday afternoon in April. But the act of taking it was not about documentation. It was the moment Garrett Harwood looked at the thing his grandfather had been building for 11 years and finally saw it with something approaching accurate vision. He had grown up watching the pile and smelling it, and watching the trucks arrive, and watching the old man move through his routines with that inexplicable patience. And he had processed all of it as the eccentric persistence of a man from another era, doing the best he could with what was available to him. He looked at that check, he looked at that pig, and he understood with the sudden and complete quality of genuine comprehension that his grandfather had not been doing the best he could with what was available. He had been building something deliberate, something with a destination. That fall, Garrett built a website. A single page, a handful of photographs taken on his phone during an afternoon in the woodlot, a few paragraphs about the farm's history, written in the plain and honest language that was the only language available when the subject was Elias Harwood, and the 88 acres his great-grandfather had bought for $1,100. He put his grandfather's phone number at the bottom. Sutton Webb told another chef. That chef told a food writer who drove out from Charlotte, walked the woodlot, pressed her palm against the dark soil the way Sutton Webb had done, and wrote a piece that ran in a regional food magazine, read by exactly the people who made the sourcing decisions that were about to remake the economics of the Harwood operation. The phone began to ring. By 2015, Elias had more demand than he could immediately satisfy. By 2016, he was no longer taking any animals to the livestock auction at all. Every Gloucester Old Spot that came out of that woodlot went directly to one of 12 restaurants across North Carolina at prices that bore no relationship to the commodity market that had been the only available frame of reference for the first decade of the operation. Garrett left his job in Raleigh in early 2016 and came home to the farm. He set up a proper invoicing system. He tracked payments and managed the restaurant relationships and coordinated the logistics of delivery with the small family-owned abattoir 40 minutes south that processed their animals with the care the operation deserved. He brought modern tools to a business built on principles that were anything but modern, and the combination worked with a naturalness that surprised him, even as it confirmed something he had been slowly understanding for 2 years. The gross revenue crossed $100,000 a year. The primary input, the spent brewery grain that had launched the entire enterprise, was still arriving free of charge twice a week on the same flatbed truck that had been making the same run for 13 years. Back at Cedar Ridge Brewing, in the well-organized office he had made his own, Nolan Briggs had continued his optimization work with consistent results. Supplier contracts renegotiated. Delivery routes restructured. Inventory software implemented. He was genuinely effective at the work his role required. The company's leadership recognized this and rewarded it. But the spent grain arrangement with Elias Harwood still lived in his operational files. Flagged, unresolved. An informal agreement with no documentation and no mechanism for extracting value from a material that Nolan had come to understand was not simply a waste stream, but a commodity with measurable market worth. In the autumn of 2016, a sales representative from a company called AgriCycle Solutions drove up from Georgia and sat across Nolan's conference table with a presentation. AgriCycle had developed a commercially viable process for taking wet spent brewery grain and converting it through industrial drying and pelletizing into a shelf-stable high-protein feed supplement sold to large commercial feedlot operations. They were expanding their collection network and looking for brewery partners in the Southeast. The model was uncomplicated. They came to you, they picked up the material, they paid you for it, $40 per ton. Cedar Ridge was producing close to 20 tons of spent grain per week. Nolan did the arithmetic with the practiced speed of a man who has spent years doing exactly this kind of calculation. 20 tons per week, 52 weeks per year, $40 per ton, $41,600 per year. Found revenue, income from a material they were currently giving away. Nolan looked at the AgriCycle representative and felt the particular satisfaction of a professional who has located an inefficiency and identified its solution. This was the work. This was why he was here. He scheduled the drive out to the Harwood farm. The F-150 was immaculate as always. The Carhartt jacket had accumulated a year's worth of actual wear since 2013, but still maintained the bearing of clothing that has not been seriously tested. Nolan found Elias at the side of the barn splitting oak rounds for winter with an axe that was older than Nolan's parents and in considerably better condition. Nolan presented the situation with the directness he had come to believe showed genuine respect for the other party's time. He explained AgriCycle. He explained the offer and the terms. He framed the change as an evolution of a mutually beneficial relationship, a natural next step for both parties, a move towards sustainability and proper accounting. And then he said that Cedar Ridge wanted to extend Elias the right of first refusal, the same price they would receive from AgriCycle, $40 per ton. He believed he was being generous. He believed the offer would likely be declined and that Elias would acknowledge the changed economics with the resigned pragmatism of an old farmer who understood how business worked, and that the transition to AgriCycle would proceed smoothly and everyone would move forward. Elias set down his axe. He stood with the handle loose in one large hand and looked at Nolan Briggs across the space between them. The woods were quiet around them. A woodpecker was working somewhere in the hickories to the north, the sound of it rhythmic and deliberate filling the silence that gathered between the two men. "I can't pay you for it," Elias said. His voice was quiet. There was no anger in it, no heat of any kind. Just a statement of fact delivered by someone who had thought the situation through to its logic. The price breaks the system. Nolan tilted his head with the expression of a man who has anticipated this response and prepared a measured reply. "I understand the adjustment is significant, but the material has real market value, and we can't continue to give it away. The economics are what they are." Elias looked at him for a long moment. The woodpecker kept working. The wind moved through the pines along the upper fence line. Then Elias said the thing that Nolan Briggs would spend the next 14 months slowly, expensively, and incompletely coming to understand. "You think you've been giving me something for free all this time," Elias said. "But you haven't. You've been paying me in grain, and I've been investing it." Nolan processed the statement the way people process statements that don't map onto the framework they're currently operating within, which is to say he registered it as unusual phrasing from an old man under stress rather than as information of substance. "I understand," he said with the measured sympathy of someone delivering unwelcome news. "But this arrangement isn't something we can continue. The last delivery will be this Thursday." He got back in the F-150 and drove down the lane. His tires raised a thin rope of dust over the gravel, and then he reached the county road and turned toward town and was gone. Garrett was in the barn when Nolan's truck came down the lane. He had heard the conversation from near the barn door, standing in the shadow of the doorframe without intending to eavesdrop, simply present. He walked out to where his grandfather was standing, watching the dust from the truck settle back onto the gravel. "What do we do, Grandpa?" he asked. His voice was careful, controlled, but the concern behind it was audible. Elias watched the last of the dust settle. He looked at the western fence line, at the pile, at the thing that had been continuously replenished for 14 years and would now have a final delivery date. "We're going to do what we've always done," he said. "Which is what?" Elias turned back toward the house. "Keep the books," he said. That evening, while Garrett sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and a notepad, and the particular kind of focused anxiety of a young man trying to model his way through a problem that has not yet fully revealed its dimensions, Elias went to the small back office off the kitchen. The room smelled of old paper and linseed oil, and the faint, pleasant ghost of pipe tobacco that had saturated the walls over decades and never entirely left. He sat down at the roll-top desk that had belonged to his father. He opened the bottom drawer and began lifting out ledger books one at a time and setting them on the cleared surface of the desk. 14 of them, one for each year. Garrett looked up from his laptop when he heard his grandfather moving through the house. He came to the doorway of the office and saw the ledgers stacked on the desk, the old man's hands moving across the covers with the careful attention of someone handling things of genuine importance. "What are those?" Garrett asked, though he already knew. "Everything," Elias said. He opened the first one to the first page and set it under the lamp. "Come sit down." The last truck came on a Thursday. Roy had been driving the Cedar Ridge route for 6 years. He knew the lane by memory, knew the exact angle to take the flatbed around the gatepost, knew the particular sound the gravel made under his tires in wet weather versus dry. He had made this run 424 times and knew it with the body knowledge that working men accumulate about the routes that structure their working lives, not as a conscious map, but as a set of reflexes built into the hands on the wheel. He backed the truck to the fence line and killed the engine and sat in the cab for a moment longer than necessary before he got out. Elias was there waiting as he always was when the truck came. It was his land and his operation, and he had long understood that presence was a form of respect, and respect was not something you rationed according to whether the occasion seemed to warrant it. Roy climbed down from the cab. He was a broad man in his mid-40s with a weathered, honest face and the careful movements of someone who has spent years working around heavy equipment and has learned to be deliberate about where he puts his weight. He took off his cap and held it in both hands, which was not something he normally did. "I'm sorry about this, Mr. Harwood," he said. "It isn't right." Elias looked at him steadily. "It's not your doing, Roy." Roy put his cap back on. He operated the controls and sent the hydraulic bed rising, and the grain slid out in a steaming mass and settled against the fence line with the familiar weight and sound that had marked the rhythm of this place for 14 years. When the bed was empty and lowered, Roy walked back to the cab and paused with his hand on the door handle. "You'll be all right," he said. It came out as a statement, but carried the uncertainty of a question. "We will," Elias said. Roy nodded once, got in, and drove away. His taillights disappeared around the bend in the lane. The sound of the engine faded through the trees. And then there was only the sounds of the farm and the surrounding land, the crows working the far field, the wind in the upper pines, the particular quality of silence that a place has when something that has been constant for a long time has just stopped. Elias stood at the fence line after the truck was gone. He looked at the pile, the last pile. No new material would arrive Monday. The pile would diminish, now drawn down by the daily feeding without being replenished, and eventually it would be gone, and the quarter acre where broom sedge had grown before Owen Calloway pointed at it on a May morning 14 years ago would return to whatever it chose to become without the steady amendment of brewery grain. He was 76 years old. His back was still straight and his hands still knew their work. But 76 years is 76 years, and he had built this system across a substantial portion of what remained of his life, and he stood at the fence line and let the weight of the moment be what it was without managing it into something more comfortable than it actually was. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. That night at the kitchen table, Elias and Garrett opened the first of the 14 ledgers together. The books were cloth-bound with green and cream-ruled pages, the kind of record-keeping ledger that had preceded computers by a century and would outlast them in legibility and durability. The handwriting inside was small, precise, and completely legible. The script of a man who had decided early that if something was worth recording, it was worth recording correctly. Every delivery was documented. Date day of the week estimated tonnage drawn from the brewery's own production records that Owen Callaway had shared informally years ago, running totals updated with each entry. Every hog born on the property, every hog sold. The buyer, the price per pound, the live or hanging weight, the total received. Every expense incurred in the operation, the cost of fencing materials across the years, the fuel for the gator, the veterinary bills, the $1,200 cash paid in October of 2003 for 3 gilts and a young boar in Sampson County. They worked through the weekend. Elias and Garrett at the kitchen table, the ledgers spread open in chronological order, a yellow legal pad for calculations, and 2 calculators on the table between them. They started with the grain. 14 years of twice-weekly deliveries. The early years at Cedar Ridge's then production level of approximately 15 tons per week, recorded in Elias's notes from Owen Callaway's estimates in those early conversations. The later years as the brewery expanded to its 60-barrel system closer to 20 tons. Elias had tracked these numbers with the same methodical consistency he brought to everything else he recorded. They worked through the ledgers entry by entry, year by year, and confirmed the figure that Elias had carried in his head for some time, but had never had reason to formalize on paper. 12,740 tons. That was the total volume of spent brewery grain deposited on the western fence line of the Harwood farm between May of 2003 and March of 2017. Then they applied the valuation that Nolan Briggs himself had established. The number the brewery's operations manager had arrived at through professional assessment of the material's commodity worth. The number he had used to calculate Cedar Ridge's projected new revenue stream. The number upon which he had based his confident conclusion that the 14-year informal arrangement was a resource being irresponsibly given away. $40 per ton. Garrett did the multiplication on the calculator and wrote the result on the legal pad in the careful figures his grandfather had taught him were the appropriate way to record numbers that mattered. $509,600. They sat with that number. Nolan Briggs had driven to the Harwood farm believing he was bringing a charitable arrangement to its logical conclusion, correcting an informality that had persisted too long, and rationalizing a resource that the brewery's scale could no longer justify giving away. He had believed he was correcting an imbalance, bringing order to something that had existed outside of order for too long. What he had actually done was calculate the value of the investment Cedar Ridge Brewing had been making in the Harwood farm for 14 uninterrupted years. He had put a number on it himself with his own professional judgment and his own market research, and the number was $509,600. Elias had taken that investment of raw material and converted it through his own labor and knowledge, and the particular quality of a patience that most people had long since abandoned as impractical into something the market valued at over $100,000 a year in direct revenue, with most of the cost structure eliminated with no debt, with a waiting list that demonstrated a gap between what the farm could currently supply and what the market would absorb. Cedar Ridge Brewing had not been doing Elias Harwood a favor. They had been funding him, without knowing it, without intending it, without any awareness that the twice-weekly disposal of their waste stream was serving as the capitalization of a business that would, in the year after they withdrew that capitalization, produce the most profitable 12 months in 128 years of Harwood family agriculture. The investment had been entirely accidental, the product of mutual convenience, rather than shared intention, and it had been more productive than most intentional investments ever managed to become. On Monday morning, Elias put on a clean shirt and drove to the county seat. The agricultural loan officer at the bank was a man named Sterling Polk, whose father had attended the same rural high school as Elias 30 years apart. Sterling was in his mid-50s and had the manner of a man who had spent enough time listening to farmers present their situations that he had developed a reliable instinct for the difference between a man asking to be rescued and a man presenting a case. Elias presented a case. He set the 14 ledgers on Sterling Polk's desk. He opened them and walked through the numbers in the same quiet and methodical way he did everything. 14 years of delivery records, 14 years of sales records showing the full arc of the operation from the commodity auction prices of the early years through the inflection point of 2014, when direct restaurant sales began, through the consistent growth in both volume and price per pound through 2015 and 2016. The gross revenue figures for the 3 most recent fiscal years. The operating cost structure lean in the way that only a business built on free inputs can be lean, but analyze carefully against what those costs would become when the free inputs were replaced by purchased alternatives. He showed Sterling the letters of intent from 7 of his 12 restaurant clients, written commitments to purchase specific volumes at agreed prices in the coming year. He showed him the waiting list documented with names and contact information and the dates inquiries had been received. He was not asking Sterling Polk for charity. He was not asking him to extend credit on the basis of character alone, though Elias Harwood's character in Caldwell County was a kind of credit that had supported transactions before. He was presenting a 14-year operational record and asking for capital to expand an enterprise that the record demonstrated was viable, demand-constrained, and capable of significant growth. Sterling Polk spent an hour with the ledgers turning pages, occasionally asking questions that Elias answered with the plain directness of someone who has kept honest records and has nothing to restate or reframe. At the end of the hour, Sterling closed the last ledger and squared it carefully on top of the others. "What do you need?" he said. "A line of credit," Elias said. "250,000. Sterling approved it before noon. While Elias and Garrett were in Sterling Polk's office, the optimized solution that Nolan Briggs had constructed was beginning its encounter with the texture of real-world logistics. AgriCycle Solutions ran their collection operation out of a facility in southern Georgia. The distance was manageable in a spreadsheet and somewhat less manageable in practice because long-haul collection routes are subject to the mechanical and scheduling variables that planning models tend to smooth over and reality tends to preserve in their full, inconvenient specificity. The AgriCycle trucks ran late with a regularity that quickly ceased to be surprising. On 2 separate occasions in the first months of the arrangement, they broke down entirely and missed their scheduled pickup. When AgriCycle missed a pickup, the spent grain sat. 20 tons of wet brewery grain in a North Carolina summer does not sit quietly. The chemistry of its souring, which begins within 24 hours of production, accelerates dramatically under heat, and the gases and compounds released in that process produce an odor that is by any honest accounting extraordinary in its persistence and reach. Cedar Ridge Brewing occupied the eastern edge of town, adjacent to a neighborhood of modest residential properties, whose residents had coexisted comfortably with the brewery for years, having never previously had reason to experience the full aromatic range of 20 tons of neglected spent grain in July. When AgriCycle missed 2 consecutive pickups during a heat wave, the grain sat for 5 days. The county health inspector arrived on the 6th day, accompanied by a clipboard and the expression of a professional who would prefer not to be doing what he is doing, but intends to do it properly regardless. He issued a citation and provided written guidance on remediation requirements. Cedar Ridge's attorneys advised rapid corrective action to prevent escalation. The corrective action took the form of a sealed containment unit, a refrigerated vessel designed to hold the grain between pickups in conditions that would prevent the neighborhood consequences of the open pile arrangement. The containment unit cost $15,000 to install. It required regular maintenance. It was a line item that had not existed in the projection Nolan had presented to Cedar Ridge's ownership when he proposed the AgriCycle arrangement. Then in the autumn of that first year, AgriCycle invoked a market conditions clause in their contract. The market for cattle feed pellets had softened. Their own margins were under pressure. They needed to renegotiate the collection price. They reduced their per-ton payment from $40 to $25. The annual revenue Nolan had projected at $41,600 was now at best $26,000 before the amortized cost of the containment unit, before the administrative hours spent managing a collection relationship with a company 200 miles away, before the unquantifiable damage to the brewery's relationship with the neighborhood it depended on for local goodwill and foot traffic. The spreadsheet had been clean. Reality was expensive, and it got more expensive as the months went on. The irony was one of those that feels almost engineered for instructional purposes. For 14 years, Elias Harwood had solved Cedar Ridge Brewing's spent grain problem with perfect reliability at zero cost, with no paperwork, no complaints from neighbors, no equipment failures, and no renegotiation of terms. He had driven the waste stream so thoroughly and efficiently into a productive use that the brewery had been able to forget it was a problem at all. In trying to monetize that arrangement, the brewery had not merely lost a partner who had been solving a real operational problem. It had created an expensive new problem for itself in the process of trying to profit from ending the solution. Elias used the line of credit with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything. He did not buy commercial pelletized feed. He did not look for the cheapest available substitute for what the brewery had provided. He thought about what the grain had actually been doing in his system, what nutritional role it had played, what the pigs had received from it that a simple commodity input might not fully replicate. And then he built a sourcing approach designed to approximate that as closely as possible with purchased materials. He bought a used 30-ton grain silo located through the same network of agricultural contacts he had always relied on for $8,000. He had a concrete pad poured and the silo positioned to receive delivery from a standard farm truck and dispensed directly to the gator. The infrastructure was simple and durable and would serve the operation for decades. He identified two grain farmers within 20 miles of the Harwood property, one who grew malting barley and one who ran a mixed corn and field corn operation. He drove out to each of them separately and had a straightforward conversation. He offered a price above the commodity market rate, not by an amount that would have struck anyone as dramatic, but by enough to matter to a small operation trying to plan a season. In exchange, he asked for a reliable annual purchase commitment that they could plan against. For small-scale grain farmers, a committed buyer at a fair price is worth considerably more than the premium suggests, because the thing it eliminates the grinding uncertainty of selling into commodity markets that don't care whether you specifically succeed or fail, has a real and ongoing cost of its own. Both farmers agreed the same week he asked them. He bought a used grinder mixer, a piece of equipment designed to combine grains and supplements into custom feed formulations for $5,000. He spent 2 weeks adjusting the blend, working through the nutritional composition of what the brewery grain had provided, and calibrating a purchased equivalent that would maintain the quality and character that his restaurant clients had come to rely on. The blend was not identical to what the pigs had eaten before. It could not be. The specific complexity of a diet incorporating fresh brewery grain and wild acorns and seasonal orchard fruit was not entirely reproducible through purchased inputs. But it was close, and close was sufficient, because the animals and their genetics and the soil they lived on and the foraging environment they inhabited were the same. His costs went up. This was a simple fact, and he accepted it without drama. Feed was a real line item now, where it had been a non-existent one, and the operation's economics adjusted accordingly. He raised his prices to the restaurants by 5%. He called each of his 12 clients personally. He told them plainly what had happened with the brewery, what it meant for his input costs, and that he was passing a portion of that cost increase along. He did not apologize. He did not embellish. He stated the facts in the direct way he stated everything. Not one of them declined. Several of them increased their orders. Because the story had spread through the close and well-connected world of serious restaurant sourcing, the way stories spread in small, attentive communities quickly and with a fidelity to the actual truth that gossip rarely maintains. The story of the brewery pulling the grain supply and the old farmer absorbing the change and continuing without missing a delivery, that story had reached the 12 restaurants and several others who had not yet managed to get off the waiting list. And the story had, if anything, made the relationship more valuable rather than less, because it added to the existing qualities of the product. The additional quality of demonstrated resilience. The evidence that the operation behind the food they were serving could withstand external disruption and keep producing. Sutton Webb, who had been the first, called from Asheville on a Thursday afternoon. "I heard what happened with the brewery," he said. "I want to double my order for next year." That was when Garrett understood that his grandfather had not simply survived the disruption. He had been strengthened by it. In August of 2017, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with the current year's ledger and his laptop and the focused attention his grandfather had spent years modeling for him. He worked through the numbers with care, the way careful records allow you to work through numbers with the confidence that comes from knowing the data is accurate because it has been recorded accurately, consistently every time. Total animals sold in the 12 months since the last Cedar Ridge delivery, 220 Gloucester Old Spots delivered to 12 restaurant clients across North Carolina. Total gross revenue from those sales. Total costs purchased: grain feed, veterinary expenses, fuel processing fees at the abattoir, equipment maintenance, and Garrett's own modest salary, which the operation had finally grown large enough to support. Net revenue. He wrote the figure on the legal pad. He looked at it for a moment. Then he got up from the table and walked out to where his grandfather was sitting on the back porch in the August heat watching the woodlot. The way he had always watched things, with a quality of attention that was not passive observation, but active and purposeful engagement with the world in front of him. Garrett handed him the legal pad. Elias looked at the figure. He held the pad for a long moment, long enough that Garrett began to wonder what he was thinking, whether the number landed differently than expected, whether something in it confirmed or contradicted something the old man had been carrying in his head. Then Elias handed the legal pad back. "Put it in the account," he said. "Grandpa." Garrett held the pad in both hands. "Do you understand what this means? This is the best year in the history of this farm. Better than any year with the free grain. Better than any year in 128 years." Elias looked out at the woodlot, at the dark soil visible between the trees, the soil that had been turned and fed and transformed over 14 years by animals eating food that a brewery had paid to discard. At the herd moving through the trees with the unhurried confidence of animals entirely suited to their environment, 40 sows and their offspring, the Gloucester Old Spots, with their heavy ears and their slow, deliberate movement, and the exceptional quality of what they produced. "It means the system works," Elias said. He said it quietly, without ceremony. "The way you state a thing that has been demonstrated and no longer requires argument." And that was all he said. The number on the legal pad was $187,450. It was the most profitable year in the history of the Harwood farm. Not the most profitable year of the Heritage Hog operation. Not the most profitable year since the restaurant relationships began. The most profitable year in 128 years of continuous family agriculture on 88 acres of North Carolina hill country, purchased in 1889 for $1,100. Achieved in the first year without a single pound of free brewery grain. The year the system was supposed to fail was the year it proved itself. In 2019, Cedar Ridge Brewing was acquired by a large beverage conglomerate headquartered in St. Louis. The transaction was covered in the regional business press as a success story. Owen Calloway, who had shaken hands with Elias Harwood on a May morning 16 years earlier and started something neither man had fully understood at the time, was quoted saying he was proud of what they had built and excited for the brand's future under new ownership. The name remained on the building. The equipment stayed where it was. The recipes were preserved in their documented form and reproduced with technical accuracy. But many people in Caldwell County said the beer was never quite the same after the sale. They said it with the specificity of people who know a product deeply enough to recognize a change that cannot be easily located in any individual ingredient or measurable parameter. The beer was consistent. But consistency is not character, and character is not something that transfers cleanly in an acquisition document. The soul of the thing had been present in the people who built it with intention and care, and the people who built it with intention and care were gone. What remained was the technical replication of what they had made produced at scale by a system optimized to replicate it indefinitely. Many of the locals after a while stopped ordering it. Nolan Briggs was transferred to the conglomerate's regional headquarters in Ohio, where he managed logistics for a portfolio of 12 acquired beverage brands. By every measurable standard available to a performance review, he was successful. He had no way of knowing and was unlikely to ever fully calculate what the spent grain decision had actually cost, relative to what it had been projected to earn. Elias Harwood died in December of 2021. He was 80 years old. He died in the farmhouse in the room where he had slept his entire life, on a cold night when ice was forming on the creek and the woodlot stood bare and quiet under a half moon that made the frost on the grass luminous in the dark. Garrett was there. He had been there for the last several weeks managing the farm and spending the evenings in the house close enough to be present when presence was needed. Elias died the way he had lived, without drama, with a quality of settledness about it that made grief feel like something that would need to wait until later to assert itself fully. He had prepared what he could prepare. He had left the ledgers in order. He had left the herd in the condition of a breeding population that would sustain and grow itself for the next generation with minimal external input. He had left the farm with no debt and with a waiting list that represented 2 full years of committed demand at prices that would allow the operation to absorb whatever changes the market brought. And he had done one other thing in the months before his strength began to leave him. He had planted trees on the ground along the western fence line, the quarter acre where the broom sedge had grown before Owen Calloway pointed at it. The ground where 12,740 tons of spent brewery grain had been deposited and absorbed over 14 years. The ground that was now the most fertile soil on the entire Harwood property, black and deep and alive, in a way that the surrounding red clay was not transformed by 14 years of steady organic amendment into something that would grow almost anything, put into it with an ease and abundance that the surrounding fields could not match. Elias planted American chestnut trees on that ground. The American chestnut is not a tree for the impatient. It was once one of the great trees of the eastern American forest, a dominant presence across millions of acres of hardwood woodland, before a fungal blight introduced in the early 20th century eliminated virtually the entire mature population within decades. Breeders and conservationists had been working for generations to develop blight-resistant varieties that could eventually be restored to something approaching the species' former presence in the eastern landscape. Those trees were available now, the product of patient breeding work spanning decades. They were by any agricultural standard a long-term investment. A chestnut planted today reaches productive maturity in decades. The men who established the great chestnut forests of the eastern United States did not plant them expecting to harvest them. They planted them because they understood something about time and about generosity and about the relationship between what one generation does and what the next generation inherits that the short-term accounting of any single life tends to obscure. Elias Harwood knew he would not live to sit under those trees. He planted them anyway. Garrett runs the farm now. The herd stands at 60 sows and 4 boars, a population that Garrett has continued to develop with the selective care his grandfather taught him across 2 decades of patient demonstration. The waiting list for their pork runs 2 years. He uses the old ledger books, the cloth-bound volumes with the green and cream ruled pages, and he keeps a digital record alongside them because he learned from his grandfather that redundancy in documentation is a form of insurance against the things you cannot anticipate. The patch of ground along the western fence line where the broom sedge grew and where the trucks came twice a week for 14 years is the most productive soil on the entire farm. It is black and deep and rich in the way that only sustained organic amendment over a long period can produce. The chestnut trees Elias planted stand in a young grove there, now growing with the slow and irrefutable progress of trees that have found good ground and intend to make full use of it. They will be large trees someday, productive trees, trees that provide mast for wildlife and structure for the landscape, and the particular quality of shade that only an old and well-established tree can provide. Garrett will likely see that. His children, if he has them, certainly will. Elias will not. He planted them anyway, because that is what patient men do. Because the truest form of generosity is not the gift you receive acknowledgement for, but the one whose effects outlast your ability to witness them. Because 14 years of watching and waiting and building toward a destination that only you can clearly see is not stubbornness and it is not eccentricity. It is a philosophy, and philosophies, the ones worth having, are meant to be planted in ground fertile enough to outlast the person who planted them. There are 2 ways to do the accounting. The first way is practiced in well-lit offices by people who are very good at converting the world into numbers and then managing the numbers with intelligence and speed. This kind of accounting is confident and fast and very good at measuring what is already visible and quantifiable. What it cannot see, it tends to discount. What it cannot measure, it tends to treat as though it does not exist or does not matter. It sees a pile of wet grain and sees a waste stream. It sees an informal arrangement and sees unmanaged risk. It sees a slow-growing heritage breed and sees an inefficiency. It is in its own context genuinely useful. And it is ultimately fragile in a specific and consistent way because the things it cannot see are often exactly the things that matter most in the long run. The second way is practiced at kitchen tables with worn pencils and cloth-bound ledger books by people who have spent enough time paying attention to specific pieces of ground to understand that the most valuable assets on a farm, and perhaps in a life, are the ones that do not appear on any balance sheet. The fertility of soil built over years of careful amendment, the genetics of a breeding herd selected with patience for qualities that the commodity market does not recognize as value, the trust of customers who have come to depend on something that cannot be easily replicated or replaced, the knowledge accumulated over decades of direct observation of a specific place and the specific system that place can support. These things do not show up in quarterly reports. They do not respond well to optimization. They are built slowly through sustained attention and the willingness to work toward a destination that will take years to reach and that other people looking on may not be able to see at all. Cedar Ridge Brewing thought it was solving a disposal problem when it sent its trucks twice a week to the western fence line of the Harwood farm. It thought it was disposing of waste. What it was actually doing for 14 uninterrupted years was making deposits into an account it did not know it owned. It was funding inadvertently and completely the creation of exactly the kind of local, authentic, rooted agricultural enterprise, that it would spend its final years as an independent company trying to present itself as being adjacent to. It was capitalizing without knowing it, the living embodiment of the values it printed on its labels and described in its marketing values. It had genuinely held when Owen Calloway drove a dusty Ford Ranger out a county road and shook hands with an old farmer on a May morning, and had slowly through growth and success and the arrival of people who measured things in different units grown away from. The truest value is never in the raw material. It is in the vision of the person who knows what to do with it. The work is the asset. Everything else is just a temporary input.